My sister tried cheating me out of the house. I staged cold-blooded revenge and made them pay rent. My name is Marin O'Reilly, and on Christmas morning, my designated place at the family table was an island of cold defiance. The old oak chair, its wood smoothed by generations of O'Reillys, had been physically dragged a few feet away from the main gathering, placing it in the draft from the front door. Its isolation was a statement, a carefully drawn border I was not meant to cross. The air in our Maple Hollow home, usually thick with the scent of pine needles and my mother's cinnamon rolls, was sharp with a new metallic tension. Outside, a delicate film of snow blanketed the roof of the house I was born in, the postcard-perfect image of a holiday I was about to be uninvited from. The table was laden with the evidence of a feast, a glistening turkey, bowls of steaming mashed potatoes, my grandmother's silver gravy boat. But every festive detail felt like a prop in a play designed to humiliate me. My younger sister Katie rose from her seat, raising a glass of mimosa. Her husband, Tom Hansen, a man whose presence in our house had grown from a guest to a fixture to an occupying force, stood beside her, his arm draped possessively around her shoulders. My parents, Richard and Ellen O'Reilly, stood just behind them, a silent, complicit wall. They studied the intricate patterns on the wallpaper, the ceiling, their own shoes, anywhere but my face. "A little announcement, everyone," Katie chirped, her voice falsely bright. The football game Tom had been blasting on the television fell silent. As you know, Tom and I are starting our future, and his parents have been so wonderful. She gestured to the Hansens, who had long ago colonized the small granny suite in the backyard, a space built for my actual grandmother. Mr. Hansen gave a magnanimous nod, as if granting us permission to exist in his orbit. Mrs. Hansen, a woman who seemed to measure her life in the inconveniences caused by others, offered a tight, reptilian smile. Katie took a breath, her smile widening into something sharp. "So, we've decided this house is needed for our new growing family. It's time for it to officially be for me, Tom, and his parents to live in." She finally turned her gaze to me, the mimosa glass glinting like a weapon. "Marin," she said, the single word dripping with condescension. "You'll need to pack your bags. We think a week should be plenty of time for you to find a new place." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. This was it, the final, formal severing. "I am 32 years old." I kept my expression perfectly neutral, my posture straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. My gaze swept across the room, a slow, deliberate inventory. I watched the triumphant smirk on Tom's face. I saw the flicker of something, guilt, fear, in my father's eyes before he looked away. I saw my mother wringing her hands, her back still turned to me, and I saw the undisguised pleasure in the eyes of Mr. and Mrs. Hansen, who were already looking around the dining room as if deciding where to hang new portraits. They were all smiling in their own ways at the thought of pushing me not just out of the house, but out of their lives. For the past 3 days, since the Hansens had arrived for the holiday, the house had ceased to be mine in any meaningful way. The living room, once my quiet evening refuge with a book, had become Tom's personal stadium. The television roared with sports from dawn until midnight, his feet propped up on the coffee table my grandmother had left specifically to me. My favorite armchair was now permanently indented with the shape of Mr. Hansen. The delicate ecosystem of our shared bathroom had been shattered. This morning, as I'd brushed my teeth, I'd heard the distinct click of Mrs. Hansen starting a timer on her phone outside the door. 17 minutes, she'd later announced to the room at large, an unacceptable amount of time for a non-contributing guest to occupy the facilities. A guest. That's what I had become in the home where my name was on the utility accounts for 2 years. Since my father's early retirement and my mother's boutique business had quietly folded, the financial stability of this house had rested on my shoulders. The electricity that powered Tom's television, the water Mrs. Hansen rationed, the high-speed internet they all consumed without a second thought. It was all paid for by automated debits from my bank account, a fact no one ever acknowledged, a fact they had, it seemed, collectively chosen to forget. To them, I was just the assistant. It was a label they applied with thinly veiled pity. "Marin is an assistant at that little real estate office," my mother would explain to friends, her tone suggesting a temporary, slightly embarrassing phase. Pioneer Meridian Realty was far from a little office, and my role as a transaction coordinator was the operational backbone of multi-million-dollar deals. But they preferred the simpler, more pathetic narrative. The assistant had no real career, no prospects, no future. Therefore, she had no right to take up space, to have a permanent home, to exist as anything more than a placeholder until she could be conveniently removed. As Katie's words hung in the air, a familiar calm settled over me. It was a state of mind honed over years of managing chaotic property closings. While others panicked, I organized. While others shouted, I documented. I made a quiet mental note, Christmas Day, approximately 11:04 a.m., verbal eviction notice delivered by Catherine O'Reilly Hansen. Witnesses present, Richard O'Reilly, Ellen O'Reilly, Thomas Hansen, John Hansen, Carol Hansen. I catalogued the specific phrasing, the confident posture, the complicit silence of the others. Every detail was a data point filed away in the steel trap vault of my memory. It was a professional habit that had become a personal survival mechanism. The rest of the day unfolded as a surreal performance of my own erasure. Dinner was served, the meal I had paid for at the grocery store last week. My father, finally forced to speak, raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the turkey. "To the new family," Tom boomed, clinking his glass against Katie's. A round of cheerful agreement went through the room, the sound scraping against my ears. When the dessert plates were cleared, Katie produced her phone. "Okay, family picture time," she declared for the Christmas card. They arranged themselves around the fireplace, the two happy couples, the proud parents and in-laws. A perfect, complete set. I stood to the side, watching. "Marin, could you get this for us?" Katie asked, holding out her phone. "It wasn't a request, it was an assignment. You're so much better at getting the right angle." I took the phone without a word. I stepped back, framed them in the lens, 6 smiling faces, flushed with wine and victory, bathed in the warm glow of the Christmas tree lights. They looked so happy, so complete. I was the ghost behind the camera, the invisible hand capturing a memory that I would have no place in. I pressed the button. The flash was a small white explosion, momentarily blinding me. "Perfect!" Katie squealed, snatching the phone back to admire the image. "Now we just need to get one with everyone," she added, a sudden performative realization dawning on her. But Tom quickly threw an arm around her. "Nah, this one's great. It's the core family, the foundation. 6 people, not 7. I was dismissed, pushed behind the lens, then erased from the album entirely. I slipped my own phone from my pocket beneath the cover of the renewed chatter. My thumb moved swiftly across the screen, my face illuminated by its cool blue light. I pulled up a single contact and typed a short, precise message. "Everything is ready. 10 a.m. tomorrow." I hit send. There was no reply, nor did I expect one. The confirmation was implicit. The machine was now in motion. As if sensing the shift in my attention, Katie turned to me, her eyes alight with a cruel sort of glee. "Oh, Marin, this will be fun. Let's make it a game. We'll do a countdown. 7 days until the room is empty. I'm going to make a chart." She laughed, a loud, theatrical sound that grated on my nerves. "Day 1, sorting. Day 2, boxing. Tom and I have been looking at king-size beds online all morning. The one we want will fit perfectly once we get all your stuff out of there." Tom chuckled along. "Yeah, a real purge. A New Year's cleanse a few days early." A purge. The word hung in the air between us, ugly and deliberate. They weren't just asking me to leave. They were relishing the act of scouring me from the premises. I didn't respond. I simply slid my phone back into my pocket and stood up from my lonely chair by the door. I walked to the dining table, now littered with the remnants of the feast, and rested my hand on its cool, solid edge. I pressed my wrist into the wood, feeling the grain beneath my skin, grounding myself in the physical reality of the moment. The house was quiet again, except for the distant drone of the television, Tom having already reclaimed his throne. They thought they were delivering a final, crushing blow. They saw a quiet, compliant assistant who would meekly pack her few belongings and disappear. They saw this as an eviction. They were wrong. This was an activation. I retreated to my room, the sound of Katie's triumphant laugh echoing from the hall as she loudly discussed her purge chart with Tom. It was a familiar dynamic weaponized for a new, cruel purpose. It was always this way. Katie, 4 years my junior, was the designated sensitive one, the one mauled by emotions. She learned very early in life that a strategically timed tear, a well-pitched sob, could bend the entire household to her will. My parents, desperate to staunch the flow of her feelings, would turn to me, the stoic, quiet older sister. "Marin, just let her have it. You're stronger than she is. You have to be the one to give in." I learned to equate strength with self-erasure. I learned to swallow my own needs until I could no longer taste them. I gave in on the doll I had wanted, on the last piece of cake on which college I would attend. I chose the state school close to home, not the out-of-state university that had offered me a scholarship, because I needed to help out. And now, sitting on the edge of the bed I'd slept in since I was 10, it was clear I was expected to give in on the house itself. The current occupation was a masterclass in this lifelong capitulation. The granny suite, the small, detached cottage my grandfather built for my grandmother, had sat empty and sacred for a year after she passed. It smelled of her lavender soap and old books. It was supposed to be a memory box. But then Tom came into the picture, and with him, the Hansons. "They're just between places," Katie had assured us, her eyes wide and pleading when her in-laws' condo sale hit a snag. "Just temporarily, Marin, I promise, until their new place closes. That was 18 months ago. The new place closed. The money was leveraged into a new fishing boat for Mr. Hanson and a luxury SUV for his wife, but they remained. Temporary became permanent. The Hansons simply stayed, and with their arrival, the alliances within the house solidified, carving me out like a tumor. My father, adrift and listless after his early retirement, discovered a shared passion for golf with Mr. Hanson. They spent weekends at the country club, a luxury my father financed with a credit card I didn't know he still had. My mother and Katie, in turn, formed a shopping alliance, bonding over near-daily trips to the outlet malls, returning with bags of things they didn't need, financed by money they didn't have. I was excised from the organism of the family. I found out about my father's birthday dinner from an Instagram post. I discovered quite by accident, when I saw my mother's phone screen, that I was not included in the O'Reilly family group chat. My phone remained silent while theirs buzzed and chimed with shared jokes, logistical plans, and photos from which I was conspicuously absent. My role was to be the silent utility, the invisible infrastructure. They didn't see me, but they would have noticed immediately if the lights went out. 2 years ago, they nearly did. A certified letter arrived from Willow County addressed to my parents. I opened it, thinking it was just another bank statement. It was not. It was a final notice of delinquency. The property taxes were over a year past due, and a lien was being placed on the house. The county was initiating foreclosure proceedings. I confronted my parents in the kitchen. My father blustered, turning purple as he mumbled about a mix-up with the escrow. My mother just cried, a thin, terrified sound. But the truth was plain, written on their faces. They had no money. They had mortgaged the house to the hilt. And now they were drowning. I looked at the peeling paint on the window frame, at the house my grandmother had loved, the walls that held every memory I owned, and I made a choice. The next morning, I liquidated the $401K I had been meticulously building since my first internship. I took the massive tax penalty and paid the full amount, the back taxes, the interest, the staggering penalties, in a single wire transfer from my personal account. It drained my savings, setting my own life back by years. And what was the response to this sacrifice? Relief, not gratitude, just a collective, odorless gasp as the problem vanished. My mother patted my arm and said, "We knew we could count on you, dear." My father clapped me on the back and said, "That's my girl." No one ever said thank you. No one ever offered to pay me back. The incident was never spoken of again, erased from the family ledger. That payment changed something in me. It was a crystallization. I stopped being their daughter. I started watching them as a creditor, as an unsecured investor in a failing business. I started noticing the small, constant paper cuts of their incompetence, and I started protecting my own data. We have a small office off the dining room where my grandfather kept his meticulous records and where the house's vital documents were stored, old deeds, warranties, my grandmother's personal files. I suggested we put a new secure lock on the door. "Just to keep everything organized and safe," I said mildly. Katie laughed in my face. "Why? It's just old paper. Besides, this is a family house. Communal property doesn't need locks." "Marin, God, don't be so weird." "Communal property doesn't need locks. That line became my new mantra. It was the key, literally, to my next move. If they wouldn't lock the door, I would. Metaphorically, I stopped being the communal resource. I began to build my own vault, and I began to log their every misstep. I became a quiet archivist of their failures. Every time I had to transfer money from my savings to the joint utility account, which was now every month, I took a screenshot of the transaction. Every late payment reminder email for the mortgage, which they hadn't realized I was still CC'd on from the tax debacle, I forwarded to a private encrypted email address. Every panicked call from a credit card company that I happened to pick up, I logged in a spreadsheet. The real catalyst came late one night, about 6 months after the tax incident. I was downstairs getting a glass of water when I heard my parents whispering in the kitchen, the lights off. They thought I was asleep. My mother was crying, her quiet, genuine sobs, not the performative ones Katie had inherited. "Richard, what do you mean it adjusts?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "The man at the bank, he said it was fixed." "It was fixed, Ellen." "For the introductory period," my father hissed back, his voice thick with a shame that sounded like anger. "It's an adjustable rate mortgage. The rate is resetting next month. The payments, Ellen, the payments are going to triple. I thought I could flip it. I thought the market would." I stood in the dark hallway, the cold tile of the floor seeping into the soles of my feet. He had refinanced again. He had lied to my mother, and he had taken out a predatory loan he couldn't understand, let alone afford. The house was bleeding out, and they were hiding it from everyone, including each other. I realized with chilling, absolute clarity, they were going to lose this house. The home my grandmother had left them free and clear, the home I had just paid thousands to save. They were going to drown, and this time they were determined to pull me under with them. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating my face in the dark. I wasn't just the assistant. I was a transaction coordinator for one of the most aggressive private real estate investment firms in the state, Pioneer Meridian Realty. I wasn't just helping out. I was the person who managed the flow of millions of dollars in hard money, who reviewed every line of every HUD statement, who coordinated with title companies, lenders, and lawyers to make sure complex, high-stakes closings happened on time. I saw every single day how the smart money operated. I typed Willow County Night Classes Real Estate Investing into the search bar. A course popped up at the local community college, single-family rental investing, creative financing. It met twice a week. I enrolled before the sun came up. I set a 5-year goal, not just to survive, but to win. My little assistant job became the perfect cover. My family's condescension was my shield. They saw me leave in my sensible work clothes and assumed I was going to fetch coffee and file papers. They had no idea I was sitting in meetings with private lenders, learning the intricacies of bridge financing. They didn't know I spent my lunch breaks analyzing tax auction lists for Willow County. They didn't know my boss, the head of Pioneer Meridian, had taken me under his wing. "Marin," he'd said to me one day, "you don't have the personality for sales. Thank God you have the mind of an operator. You see the structure behind the chaos. That's rarer, and it's where the real money is." I learned. I absorbed everything. I learned how to buy distressed assets, how to force appreciation through strategic renovation, and how to structure deals so my own name was protected behind a series of LLCs. A year after that night in the hallway, I bought my first property. It wasn't much, a tiny foreclosed studio condo in Northbridge, a neighborhood they considered up-and-coming, which was their code for beneath them. I bought it at a tax auction using the last of my rebuilt savings and a small private loan from an investor my boss introduced me to, which I paid back in 4 months. I renovated it myself on weekends, tiling the bathroom and painting the walls, telling my family I was helping a friend move. I put a tenant in on a 12-month lease. The small, sweet cash flow started. I didn't spend it. I saved it. I leveraged it. I rolled that first small win into a second, a 2-bedroom condo in a building near the university. Then a small, single-family house in a suburb I knew was about to benefit from a new commuter rail line. I learned to spot value where others, like my father, saw only ruin or a quick, foolish flip. That was 3 years ago. As I sat in my childhood bedroom, listening to Tom and Katie laugh downstairs about the king-sized bed they had ordered, my portfolio consisted of 6 properties, all cash flowing, all appreciating. 3 stable single-family homes in the suburbs, and 3 high-demand condos in the city, all of them held in a trust, all of them standing in my name. I had built an ark, board by board. While they mocked me for being a lowly assistant playing with paperclips, I had become the very thing they thought they were, a person of property, of substance, of power. I never boasted. I never dropped a single hint. I just kept my head down, paid the utilities for their crumbling house, and waited. I watched the interest rates climb. I watched my father's adjustable rate mortgage reset. I watched the bank's notices grow more frantic, the ones I silently archived in my secure file. I knew the cycle was coming this Christmas with their arrogant, cruel announcement. They hadn't just given me an eviction notice, they had signaled the end of the cycle, and they had, in their magnificent, self-absorbed blindness, given me the perfect righteous justification for what was to come. The cycle hadn't just ended, it was time for the harvest. The festive paper plates and plastic champagne flutes from dinner had been swept into a trash bag, but the celebration continued, mutating into something more sinister. The living room, bathed in the garish, blinking lights of the Christmas tree, had become the venue for my unofficial farewell party. My father had put on a playlist of jaunty holiday classics, the upbeat tempo a grotesque counterpoint to the tension coiling in the air. They were toasting new beginnings, their voices loud and forced, the clinking of their glasses like small, sharp cracks in the foundation of my life. I watched from the doorway, a ghost at my own wake. They were celebrating my erasure, and they wanted me to watch. The main event began when Katie, her face flushed with a second glass of cheap Prosecco, grabbed a yellow tape measure from the junk drawer. Tom followed her with a notepad and pen, a dutiful and eager accomplice. They bounded up the stairs, their footsteps heavy with purpose, my purpose. They pushed open my bedroom door without knocking. I was sitting on the bed, a single open suitcase in front of me. I didn't look up. I didn't have to. "Okay, so," Katie began, her voice echoing slightly in the small space. "If we put the king bed against this wall—" The metal tongue of the tape measure hissed as she extended it. Tom grunted in approval. "Yeah, that gives us 76 inches. Perfect. That leaves plenty of room for my vanity table over here by the window. Good light there for doing your makeup," Tom added, scribbling on his pad. "We'll need to get a new outlet installed, maybe 2. They moved around me as if I were a piece of furniture they hadn't yet decided what to do with. They were not speaking to me, but around me, their words mapping out a future that had no space for me in it. Every comment, every measurement was a small, deliberate act of violence. They were dissecting my space, my history, and assigning it new ownership. While I was still breathing the air in the room, I remained still. My focus narrowed to the task at hand. I took a neatly folded sweater from a drawer before placing it in the suitcase. I picked up a document from a small pile on my nightstand. It was last month's electricity bill. I unfolded it, making sure the payer Marin O'Reilly line was visible along with the address of this house. I carefully clipped it to the collar of the sweater with a paperclip and then laid it gently in the suitcase. Next, a pair of jeans. I clipped the quarterly water bill to the waistband, a stack of books, my favorites. Each received a receipt for the high-speed internet service I paid for. It was a slow, methodical process, a silent accounting. I was packing my life, and I was packing the proof that I had been the one keeping theirs afloat. Each paper-clipped receipt was a quiet, irrefutable invoice for their betrayal. I could hear their voices moving back toward the door. As they stepped into the hallway, their volume dropped. I heard my mother's softer tones join theirs on the landing. She must have come up to see what the commotion was. "Is she being difficult?" my mother whispered. "No, she's just sitting there," Katie whispered back, annoyed. "It's so weird, like she's not even listening." There was a pause, a soft sigh. Then came the words that severed the last frayed thread of hope I might have held for my mother's conscience. "Well," she murmured, her voice full of a weary resignation that was a betrayal in itself. "I'm sure she understands how things are. She's a practical girl." A practical girl. The phrase landed like a slap. Practicality was my assigned role, my burden. It meant I was the one who was supposed to absorb the pain, to accept the injustice, to quietly step aside so that others could have what they wanted without consequence. I was supposed to understand. I was supposed to make it easy for them. I waited until their footsteps faded back down the stairs, followed by a fresh burst of forced laughter from the living room. Then I turned my attention back to the second small pile on my nightstand, my phone. I unlocked it, the screen casting a pale light on my face. I sent a text message to the contact labeled Alden. All elements are in place for 10 hours, confirming documents, timeline, and your presence as witness. The reply came back in less than 10 seconds. As I knew it would, confirmed. I will be punctual. See you tomorrow, Marin. I closed the message and took a deep, steadying breath. One final piece of preparation. I swiped to my laptop, which was open on my desk. I clicked print. In the silence of the room, the gentle whirring of my wireless printer downstairs in the office was almost imperceptible. It was a sound no one else would notice over the Christmas music and the football commentary Tom had turned back on. A few seconds later, it fell silent. Downstairs, sitting in the output tray, was a crisp, clean copy of a document I had spent years working toward, a certified copy of the grant deed for 142 Maple Hollow Lane. The final act of the night was for me. I pulled up a photo on my phone, a high-resolution scan I had taken of the deed's final page. I zoomed in on the embossed crimson seal of the Willow County Recorder's office, the official stamp that made it all real, legal, and absolute. I set the image as my new lock screen. It was a promise to myself, a reminder of the cold, hard, legal reality that was about to collide with their comfortable, self-serving fiction. I slept for exactly 6 hours. When I woke at 7:00 a.m., the world outside my window was muffled and white. The light snow from yesterday had intensified overnight, blanketing the town in a thick, insulating silence. It was perfect. The weather would keep everyone indoors, a captive audience. I showered and dressed in my best work attire, a charcoal gray blazer, tailored trousers, a simple silk blouse, armor. When I came downstairs, the house was a wreck of Christmas morning detritus. Torn wrapping paper, empty boxes, and dirty plates littered the living room. The Hansons were already awake, watching a morning news program at a deafening volume. Mrs. Hanson glanced at me as I poured a cup of coffee, her eyes taking in my clothes with a dismissive sniff. Going for a job interview already? Good for you. Proactive. I didn't reply. I just took my coffee and stood by the front window, watching the snowfall. I tracked the minutes on my phone, the image of the crimson seal a small, steady pulse of power beneath my thumb. 9:58 a.m. The snow was coming down in thick, lazy flakes. I could hear Katie and Tom moving around upstairs, probably admiring the empty space they had already claimed in their minds. My parents were in the kitchen, their murmurs low and indistinct. A fragile, temporary peace had settled over the house, the calm before the storm I had summoned. 9:59 a.m. I walked to the front door and placed my hand on the cold brass of the doorknob. My own reflection was a faint ghost in the beveled glass. My face was calm, my eyes clear. I felt no fear, no hesitation, just a profound, thrumming sense of inevitability. I had built this moment piece by painful piece, and it was finally here. 10:00 a.m. The doorbell rang. The sound was not the cheerful, musical chime it was designed to be. In the tense silence of the house, it was a piercing, authoritarian summons, a hammer blow against the door. In the living room, the television chatter abruptly ceased. Every head turned. Tom and Katie appeared at the top of the stairs, their faces a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. My father emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. The figure on the other side of the glass was a tall silhouette against the wall of white snow. He wore a dark gray overcoat, flakes of snow melting on his shoulders. He held a handsome, structured leather briefcase in one hand. It was Mrs. Hanson who broke the silence, her voice sharp and impatient as she squinted toward the door. Delivery on the day after Christmas? What now? All eyes were on the door, on the stranger waiting outside. No one was looking at me. I took a single step forward, my hands still resting on the doorknob. I allowed a small, tight smile to touch my lips. No, I said, my voice clear and steady in the sudden, absolute silence of the room. Not a delivery. I turned the knob, pulling the heavy door inward to reveal the calm, professional face of my lawyer, Mr. Alden. I looked back at the 6 stunned faces of my family, a transfer of power. Mr. Alden stepped over the threshold, bringing a gust of cold, snow-filled air into the suddenly silent room. He was a man in his late 50s, tall and impeccably dressed, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite and then tasked with memorizing the state's entire legal code. He gave a single, sweeping glance that took in the 6 stunned faces before him, his expression unreadable. He closed the door behind him with a soft, definitive click. "Good morning," he said, his voice a calm, resonant baritone that cut through the tension. "My name is Arthur Alden. I am an attorney." He walked past me, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the hardwood floor, and set his briefcase squarely on the center of the dining room table. The movement was deliberate, an act of claiming territory, with 2 sharp metallic clacks. He unfastened the latches. The sound was unnaturally loud in the dead quiet of the house. It was the sound of a clock striking midnight, of a game ending. He opened the briefcase and began to remove files, arranging them in neat stacks on the polished wood. He did not look at anyone as he spoke, his attention focused entirely on the documents before him. "I am here this morning," he began, his tone purely informational, as if he were delivering a weather report, "to clarify the ownership status and residency rights pertaining to this property located at 142 Maple Hollow Lane, Willow County." He paused, letting the formal legal language settle over the room like a shroud. Tom, still standing at the top of the stairs, took a half-step forward. "What the hell is this? Who are you?" Alden did not look up. "As I stated, my name is Arthur Alden, and this," he said, tapping the top document in the first stack, "is a copy of a notice of default filed by Northwood Financial with the Willow County Recorder's Office 94 days ago." He looked directly at my father for the first time. "Mr. O'Reilly, you will recognize this document. It was sent to you via certified mail and you signed for it. It informed you that, due to significant and sustained non-payment on your adjustable-rate mortgage, the lender was activating the acceleration clause and initiating foreclosure proceedings." The color drained from my father's face. He looked at my mother, a quick, panicked glance that was a complete confession. She stared back at him, her eyes wide with a shared, sickening knowledge. They knew, of course they knew, this entire Christmas eviction charade wasn't just cruel. It was a desperate, last-ditch attempt to secure a roof over their own heads by throwing me out before the bank did it to all of us. They were trying to beat the clock, and they had just run out of time. That's a lie. That's impossible!" Katie shrieked from the stairs, her voice cracking with a childish rage. She ran down into the living room, her face contorted. "This is my parents' house. They own it. You can't just come in here and say things like that." Mr. Alden's gaze remained fixed on my father. "Is it a lie, Mr. O'Reilly?" he asked, his voice dropping a register. My father opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He just shook his head, a tiny, defeated gesture. Alden turned his attention back to his files. Following the legally mandated notice period, during which the default was not cured, the lender proceeded as planned. 62 days ago, a notice of trustees' sale was publicly posted. The sale was scheduled, advertised, and conducted in full compliance with state law. He picked up the second document. This is the official record of that sale. A public auction held on the steps of the Willow County Courthouse 30 days ago. He slid the document across the table. It glided over the wood and came to a stop directly in front of my father's trembling hands. The others crowded around, peering at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. I could see the official letterhead, the columns of legal text, the bolded numbers. Katie jabbed a finger at the page. I don't understand this. Who is Pioneer Meridian? What is this?" "Pioneer Meridian Trust Escrow was the winning bidder at the auction," Alden stated simply. "The final bid, as you can see, was for the full amount of the outstanding debt plus all associated fees. The transaction was a cash purchase, closing in 72 hours. The funds were transferred, the title was cleared, and the sale was recorded." He let that sink in. The previous ownership was extinguished. The house was sold. A wave of fresh chaos erupted. Tom collapsed onto the nearest armchair as if his legs had given out. "Sold? What do you mean? Sold to who?" Mr. Hanson let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh, a sound of pure disbelief. "This is insane. You can't be serious." I am never anything but serious when it comes to recorded deeds and transferred titles, Alden replied, his voice still unnervingly calm. He looked at Katie, who was staring at him, her mind clearly unable to process the information. To answer your question, Pioneer Meridian Trust Escrow is, as the name suggests, a trust, a legal entity used to hold assets. It is not, however, the beneficial owner. He paused, his eyes slowly moving from Katie to Tom to the Hansons to my parents before finally coming to rest on me, where I stood silently by the door. The sole beneficiary of that trust, the individual who provided the funds for the purchase, the new legal and undisputed owner of this property, he announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality, is Ms. Marin O'Reilly. The explosion was not of sound, but of silence, a thick, suffocating vacuum that sucked all the air out of the room. 6 faces, 6 masks of incredulous horror, all turned to me. They stared as if they had never truly seen me before. The quiet assistant, the practical girl, the family utility. That person had just vanished, replaced by this stranger who had just bought their world out from under them. Tom's jaw was hanging open. Mr. Hanson's bitter laugh had died in his throat, replaced by a mottled, red-faced fury. Mrs. Hanson looked as if she had been turned to stone. Katie just shook her head back and forth, whispering, "No, no, no, no." My mother was the one who finally found her voice. "Marin," she breathed, the single word a universe of confusion and betrayal. "What is this? This is a joke, right? A horrible, cruel joke." I did not answer her. Instead, I walked to the dining room table and set down my own folder, the one I had prepared. I opened it and took out the first page. "This is not a joke," I said, my voice as level and calm as Alden's. "This," I slid the document toward them, "is the rent roll and current statement for my 6 other investment properties." They stared at the spreadsheet. It was a neat grid of addresses, tenant names, lease start and end dates, monthly rents, and year-to-date income, Northbridge, downtown, the suburbs, 6 properties, 6 streams of income. "This is a market valuation and inspection report for each property," I continued, placing a thick, bound document on top of the first, complete with photographs, recent appraisals, and insurance binders. I flipped it open to a random page showing a cheerful-looking colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn. This one, for example, grosses over $3,000 a month. The tenant is a lovely family of 4. Finally, I produced a single cream-colored envelope, and this is a letter from my wealth management advisor at the bank. I took the letter out and placed it on the pile. The bank's logo was embossed at the top. I read the key line aloud for them. "We are pleased to confirm that our valued client, Ms. Marin O'Reilly, maintains a substantial and diversified portfolio with a remarkably low debt-to-asset ratio. Her payment history on all managed accounts is, and has always been, perfect." The room was a tableau of shattered realities. The narrative they had constructed about me, the poor, struggling assistant with no future, had just been systematically, brutally dismantled and replaced with a truth they could not comprehend. My mother picked up the bank letter with a hand that shook so badly the paper rattled. She stared at my name, then at the list of properties, then back at me. Her face was a ruin of confusion. "Marin, when?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. How did you do all of this?" I looked at her, at the woman who had stood by while her daughter was being evicted, the woman who had called her a practical girl who would surely understand. I felt nothing, no anger, no pity, just the cold, clean finality of a transaction completed. "I started," I said, my voice precise and clear, each word a perfectly sharpened needle. "The night I heard you crying in the kitchen about Dad's adjustable-rate mortgage." Then I turned my eyes to Katie, who stood frozen in place, the arrogant smirk from yesterday now a slack-jawed mask of horror. "But I truly committed," I added, letting my gaze sweep over all of them, the 6 people who had been so eager to see me gone, the day my sister told me that communal property doesn't need locks. Mr. Alden allowed the silence to stretch, letting the full weight of his last statement settle upon them. He watched their stunned, horrified faces with the dispassionate air of a biologist observing specimens under a microscope. When he judged the moment to be right, he reached back into his briefcase. He retrieved 2 thick stacks of paper, each neatly bound with a clip. He placed them side by side on the dining table, creating 2 distinct, unavoidable options. "Now," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the paralysis that had gripped the room, to the matter at hand. As the new owner, Ms. O'Reilly has full legal authority to determine the occupancy of this residence. She has graciously decided to present you with two, and only two, possible paths forward. He slid the first stack toward the center of the table. This is option A. It is a standard month-to-month residential lease agreement. It would allow you to remain in this house as tenants. Then he slid the second stack, slightly thinner, next to it. And this is option B. It is a formal notice to vacate. It requires all current non-owner occupants to remove themselves and their personal property from these premises within 14 calendar days. Failure to comply will result in the immediate filing of an unlawful detainer lawsuit. The air, which had been thick with shock, now crackled with a new, frantic energy, a lease, a notice to vacate. These were the cold, impersonal terms of business, not family. My father was the first to react, reaching out a trembling hand for the lease agreement. His eyes scanned the first page, his face growing paler with every line he read. Mr. Hanson, recovering from his initial shock, lumbered over and snatched a copy from the pile. He flipped through the pages, his breathing growing heavier. The terms of the lease are non-negotiable, Alden continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. I will summarize the key points for you. First, the rent. He named a figure, a precise 4-digit number that was meticulously calculated to be the exact fair market rental value for a house of this size in this specific Maple Hollow neighborhood. According to the latest market analysis, this amount is due in full on the first of every month with no grace period. Late payment will incur an immediate 10% penalty. A strangled, choking sound came from Mr. Hanson. He stared at the number on the page as if it were a physical blow. The figure was likely more than the mortgage payment had been on the house he'd gleefully sold to finance his leisurely retirement. The staggering cost of no longer living for free was dawning on him in real time. But that's outrageous, he sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. We can't afford that. It is the market rate, Alden replied coolly without looking at him. Ms. O'Reilly is running a business, not a charity. Second, he went on, the utilities. As of today, the existing utility accounts in Ms. O'Reilly's name will be closed. To remain, you will be required to open new accounts in your own names for electricity, water, gas, and internet. The property is currently on a single set of meters. The lease stipulates that you will be responsible for the cost of having a licensed contractor install submeters to separately measure the consumption of the main house and the granny suite. This work must be completed within 30 days at your own expense. He was systematically dismantling their entire way of life. No more leeching off my accounts. No more communal pot they didn't have to contribute to. Every kilowatt, every gallon of water would now be accounted for. Third, Alden said, his voice relentless, maintenance and repairs. The landlord, Ms. O'Reilly, will be responsible for major structural and systems maintenance as required by law. All other repairs, including minor plumbing, appliance issues, and general upkeep, are the tenant's responsibility. Absolutely no unauthorized alterations, repairs, or additions to the property are permitted. Any work must be approved in writing and performed by a licensed and insured professional. His eyes flickered for a moment toward Tom, who had a habit of fixing things around the house with duct tape and a misplaced sense of confidence. Katie, who had been standing frozen, finally snapped out of her trance. Her face crumpled, the old, familiar tears welling in her eyes. It was the weapon she had used against me her entire life. She turned to me, her voice a pathetic, pleading whine. Marin, please, you can't do this. We're sisters. This is our home. You can't just charge us rent. Can't you just let us stay for a few months just to figure things out? I met her tear-filled gaze. For the first time, I felt nothing. The old trigger, the ingrained instinct to soothe her, to give in, was gone. I simply raised my hand and pointed a single, steady finger at a paragraph on the lease agreement in front of her. Paragraph 17, Default and Remedies. Read that line, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Her eyes, blurred with tears, struggled to focus on the text. I watched as she read the words aloud, her voice barely a whisper. Failure to remit payment by the due date constitutes a material breach of this agreement and will result in the immediate assessment of late fees and the commencement of eviction proceedings as permitted by law. I had written that clause myself. She looked up at me. Her last weapon having failed, the tears were useless against the black and white of a contract. My father, seeing his daughter's appeal fail, decided to try his own. He came to my side, placing a hand on my arm. It felt like the touch of a stranger. "Marin, honey," he began, his voice low and conspiratorial, the voice he used when he wanted to make a problem disappear. This is a lot to take in. Can't we just talk about this as a family? Surely there can be some leniency, some compromise." I pulled my arm away from his touch. I looked him directly in the eye, at the man who had stood silently by while his wife and daughter planned to make me homeless. "I tried to talk as a family," I said, my voice cold and hard as steel. "I did that for 32 years. It got me a chair by the drafty door and a 7-day notice to get out. That part of our relationship is over. Today, I am not your daughter. I am your landlord. And a landlord's job is to collect the rent, not to be a shield for other people's bad decisions." My words hung in the air, a final, brutal declaration of independence. My father recoiled as if I had physically struck him. "Perhaps I should clarify the alternative," Mr. Alden interjected smoothly, sensing the collapse of any further negotiation. He picked up the notice to vacate. "Should you choose option B, or should you sign the lease and subsequently fail to meet its terms, we will proceed with a formal eviction. I want you all to understand what that entails." He looked at each of them in turn, ensuring he had their full, terrified attention. "An unlawful detainer lawsuit is a public record. Once filed, it is searchable. A judgment against you, which I assure you we would obtain, would appear on your credit reports for up to 7 years. It would make it exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, for you to rent another property from any reputable management company. It can be grounds for denial of certain professional licenses. In some cases, it can even affect employment opportunities. You would be branded, in the eyes of the law and the financial world, as high-risk, undesirable tenants." He placed the notice back on the table. "The choice, of course, is yours." It was a checkmate. He had not raised his voice. He had not threatened. He had simply laid out the cold, hard mechanics of the law, and in doing so, had shown them the terrifying abyss that lay just beyond the edge of their defiance. There was no escape. There was no third option. The fight went out of them all at once. The furious indignation, the pleading, the blustering had all evaporated, leaving behind a residue of pure, desperate fear. My father was the first to break. With a deep, shuddering sigh of defeat, he picked up the pen Alden had placed on the table. He found the signature line on the lease agreement for the main house and signed his name. "My mother," her face a pale, tear-streaked mask, signed below him without a word. Tom watched them, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He snatched the pen from my father's hand and scribbled his signature next to Katie's line with a violent, angry slash of ink. Katie, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, took the pen and added her own shaky, tear-blotted signature. That left the Hansons. Mr. Hanson stood rigid, his arms crossed over his chest in a last pathetic gesture of resistance. "We won't sign," he growled. "This is coercion." "It is a contract," Alden corrected him. "You are free to refuse it, in which case your 14-day notice begins now." Mrs. Hanson looked at her husband, her eyes wide with panic. "John, where would we go? We sold the condo. We have nowhere to go." That was the final, critical piece of information I had been waiting for. They had burned their boats. They had been so certain of their victory, so sure of their new, permanent home, that they had left themselves with no retreat. The fight drained from Mr. Hanson's face, replaced by the gray, haggard look of a man who had just lost everything. He walked to the table, took the lease agreement for the granny suite, and signed his name. His wife followed suit, her signature a barely legible scrawl. It was done. I looked at the 6 of them, scattered around the dining room like the survivors of a shipwreck. Less than 24 hours ago, they had been a triumphant, unified front celebrating my impending exile. They had held all the power. Now their signatures were drying on a legal document that bound them to me, their landlord. The 6 people who had tried to throw me out were now legally obligated to pay me for the privilege of staying. The reversal was absolute. The power had not just shifted. It had been transferred in full with the stroke of 6 pens. With the last signature drying on the last lease, a new kind of silence fell over the room. It was not the stunned, disbelieving silence of before, but the heavy, suffocating quiet of total defeat. They were no longer a family plotting an eviction. They were 6 individuals, now legally bound to 2 separate, unforgiving contracts. Mr. Alden neatly gathered his copies of the signed documents, placed them in his briefcase, and snapped the latches shut with a sound of profound finality. He gave me a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and left without another word, closing the front door softly behind him. The cold gust of air he'd let in was gone. Now they were trapped in here with me. I stepped forward into the center of the room, taking the position of authority that was now officially mine. They watched me, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear, hatred, and a dawning, horrified respect. "Let's be perfectly clear about how things will proceed from this moment forward," I began, my voice devoid of any emotion. It was the same tone I used when dictating the terms of a complex commercial deal. "There are 2 leases, one for the main house signed by the 4 of you," I gestured to my parents, Katie and Tom, "and one for the granny suite signed by Mr. and Mrs. Hanson." I paused, letting my gaze travel from one miserable face to the next. "These are separate legal agreements. Your finances are no longer intertwined in the eyes of this property's ownership. If one household defaults, it will not be the responsibility of the other to cover the shortfall. Each lease stands or falls on its own. There will be no covering for each other. There will be no family arrangements. There is only the contract." This was the first, most crucial cut. I was severing the dysfunctional codependency that had allowed them to survive for so long. Now they were 2 isolated financial entities, each responsible for their own survival. "Furthermore," I continued, "you will have no further direct contact with me regarding this property. All communication, maintenance requests, questions about the lease, and most importantly, all payments will be handled exclusively through my designated agent." I pulled a business card from my blazer pocket. "This is Maple Ridge Property Management. You will receive an email from them this afternoon with instructions for setting up your online tenant portals. Your prorated rent for the remainder of this month, plus the security deposit as outlined in your leases, is due by 5 o'clock this evening. Their system accepts credit cards if that's helpful." The subtle barb about their likely lack of liquid cash landed exactly as intended. I then walked into the small office off the dining room, the one Katie had declared didn't need a lock. From my folder, I produced a brand new deadbolt, still in its packaging, and the key that went with it. I placed the lock on the desk. "This room contains the property's historical records and the central wiring panel. It is no longer communal space. It is a utility and storage room for landlord use only. It will be secured." I then took the key and put it in my own pocket. The symbolism was not lost on them. "Now," I said, picking up a clipboard from my bag, "I will be conducting a formal move to an inspection to document the current condition of the property's assets." I started in the kitchen. I clicked my pen and began speaking in a clear, detached monotone as if they weren't even there. "Kitchen, refrigerator, brand Maytag, serial number." I opened the door and read the number from the interior panel. "Note, minor scratching on left door. All shelves present. Functioning." I moved to the stove. "Oven, brand General Electric. All 4 burners operational. Oven light is out. Tenant will be responsible for bulb replacement." I moved through the house like a stranger, a census taker of their ruin. With every item I documented, I could feel their humiliation deepening. This was their home filled with their things, their memories, and I was treating it like a sterile, depreciating asset, which is exactly what it now was. When I got to the living room, Tom, who was still slumped in the armchair, snarled, "This is ridiculous! We live here!" "You are tenants here," I corrected him without looking up from my clipboard. "And this inspection protects both parties. It ensures you will not be held responsible for pre-existing damage, and it ensures that I will be able to bill you for any new damage you cause during your tenancy." I took a photo of a water stain on the ceiling with my phone, the flash making my mother flinch. After documenting the main house, I proceeded to the granny suite. The Hansons stood by the door, rigid and silent, as I photographed their furniture in relation to the walls and noted the condition of the carpet. The entire process took 45 minutes. 45 minutes of cold, procedural dominance that stripped away any last vestige of their familial authority. My final tasks were about control. I walked to the small wooden key cabinet by the back door, where a row of hooks held keys for every lock in the house. I located the one marked Master, all doors. I took it off the hook. Then I took the spare key to the front door. I held them up for a moment. These are no longer needed. I slipped them into my pocket. A locksmith from Maple Ridge will be here tomorrow morning at 9 to rekey the front door, I announced to the room at large. You will each be issued one new key per your lease. You are not permitted to make copies. All locks are now the property and responsibility of the landlord. I stood before them one last time. My inspection complete, my new rules established. My suitcase, the one I had packed with my paper-clipped invoices, sat by the door. But I wasn't going to take it. It had served its purpose as a prop. I will be scheduling the first of the quarterly inspections in approximately 90 days, I said. You will, of course, receive the legally required 24-hour written notice. This was the final turn of the screw, the promise of my continued, legally sanctioned intrusion into their lives. I looked around the room at the blinking Christmas lights that now seemed to be mocking them, at the debris of their stolen holiday, at their 6 shattered faces. This is not our house anymore, I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. This is a rental property. I suggest you start treating it, and your obligations to it, as such. And with that, I was done. I didn't look at any of them again. I walked to the front hallway, but instead of picking up my suitcase, I picked up a small cardboard box from the floor by the coat rack. It was all I had ever intended to take. Inside was a single silver-framed photograph of my grandmother, her smile warm and genuine. Tucked behind it was the original stamped receipt from the Willow County Tax Office, the one that proved I had been the one to save this house 2 years ago. I walked out the front door and did not look back. I didn't slam it. I closed it gently, the click of the latch the only sound. The world outside was brighter. The heavy snow had stopped, and a pale, wintry sun was breaking through the clouds. The air was clean and cold and sharp in my lungs. My car was the only one in the driveway not covered in a thick blanket of snow. I had parked it on the street last night, already separating myself. The drive back to my own apartment in Northbridge was quiet. The streets were mostly empty, the world still slumbering in a post-holiday haze. When I walked into my own space, the silence was a comfort. It was a minimalist apartment, decorated in cool tones of gray and white, with clean lines and no clutter. It was a space that was entirely, unequivocally mine. I walked to the sleek, modern kitchen and placed the single key to my own front door on the quartz countertop. Then I took out the small box, set my grandmother's picture on the counter, and put the tax receipt away in a file, a piece of history archived and closed. I opened my laptop. On the screen was my to-do list for the coming week. The first item was, finalize acquisition of the Miller Street duplex. This whole ordeal, this seismic, life-to-altering event, was just one transaction. It was already in the past. I had a new deal to focus on. My phone buzzed on the counter beside me. I picked it up. It was an automated notification from the Maple Ridge property management software, payment received, tenant Richard O'Reilly. Amount, prorated rent plus security deposit. Property, 142 Maple Hollow Lane. A second buzz moments later, payment received, tenant John Hanson. Amount, prorated rent plus security deposit. Property, 142 Maple Hollow Lane, Suite B. They hadn't even waited for the 5 o'clock deadline. They had paid immediately. The fear had worked. I navigated to the task manager on my computer. I found the entry I had made for myself weeks ago, execute 142 Maple Hollow Lane recovery. I checked the box next to it. A satisfying line appeared through the text, completed. I stood in the quiet of my own home, the pale afternoon sun streaming through the large windows. For the first time, the silence wasn't an absence of their noise. It wasn't a lonely, empty space. It was a presence. It was the sound of my own thoughts, my own plans, my own future. It was the sound of being free, and I was learning to love it. The first 30 days were a blizzard of frantic, automated notifications. The prorated rent and security deposits were paid on Christmas Day as demanded. The locksmith rekeyed the locks on December 26th. The sub-meters for the granny suite were installed on January 15th, the day before the contractual deadline, the payment no doubt scraped together in a panic. The new utility accounts were transferred, a process that, according to the forwarded emails, involved 3 failed credit checks before my mother had to use the deed to my grandmother's wedding ring as collateral for the deposit. Then the new rhythm began, a rhythm of silence. I did not go back. I did not call. I did not respond to the 2 tearful, rambling voicemails my mother left on my personal phone, which I promptly blocked. My instructions to Sarah at Maple Ridge Property Management were absolute. My personal relationship with the tenants is irrelevant. You are to enforce the lease agreement to the letter. No exceptions, no family considerations, no extensions, no leniency. Handle them as you would any other B-class rental property. For 3 months, I lived my life. I closed on the Miller Street duplex. I began renovations on a small commercial property downtown. I dated. I went to the gym. I read books in my quiet, clean apartment. The house on Maple Hollow Lane became what it was always meant to be, an asset on a balance sheet, a line item in my portfolio. The first attempt to break the firewall came precisely 90 days in, just before the 3rd rent payment was due. It was an email from Mrs. Hanson sent directly to the Maple Ridge general inbox and forwarded to me by Sarah with the simple subject line, R.E., 142 Maple Hollow, Suite B, a family matter. The email itself was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive entitlement. It was long, winding, and full of sycophantic praise for how wonderfully I was doing in my little career. It detailed her husband's bad back from the golfing. I assumed, though she implied it was from the stress of their new situation, and her own delicate constitution. It concluded with a request that was phrased as a foregone conclusion, and so, given our close family connection through Tom and Katie, we are certain there has been a simple misunderstanding regarding the rental rate. No one would expect a family member to profit from their own kin. We are confident that you will adjust the rate to a more appropriate in-law discount, perhaps just covering the base taxes, and we look forward to receiving the updated, corrected invoice. Blessings, Carol Hanson. My reply to Sarah was a single line, send template R04, rent amount, non-negotiable. The response that went back to Mrs. Hanson less than 10 minutes later was a beautiful, sterile piece of corporate communication. Dear Tenant Hanson, this email is to confirm receipt of your message. Per your signed lease agreement dated December 26th, Clause 4A, the monthly rent for 142 Maple Hollow Lane, Suite B, is set at amount. This rate is non-negotiable and reflects the current fair market value. We remind you that all rent payments are due on the 1st of the month. Thank you for your continued tenancy. Sincerely, Maple Ridge Property Management. The second wave of resistance came, as expected, from Katie. She couldn't fight me with contracts, so she tried to fight me with public opinion. Her Instagram stories, once a feed of brunch photos and wedding planning, became a passive-aggressive burn book. Just discovered who my real friends are. It's so cold when people who are supposed to love you only care about money. Being an adult is hard, but it's harder when the people who should be your safety net are the ones who cut the rope. Praying for those with hearts full of ice. They must be so, so lonely. I would have never seen them, but a mutual acquaintance from high school forwarded me a screenshot. Hey, Marin, what is going on with your sister? Is everything okay? But Katie, in her magnificent self-absorption, had miscalculated the audience. She was no longer a child. She was a married woman, and her vague pleas for sympathy rang hollow. The real drama, I was told, was happening in the comments of her actual posts. A friend of hers had written, "Hang in there, girl, so awful what you're going through." And another friend, a more practical one, had replied, "Wait, what's going on? Aren't you living at your parents' house?" Katie had replied, "It's my sister's house now, and she's a heartless landlord." The killer comment, the one that made her lock her account, came from a girl we both knew, but why would you expect to live in your sister's house for free? My landlord isn't heartless for charging me rent. Am I missing something? Her social blade had been turned back on herself. She was learning that the world had as little patience for her perceived victimhood as I now did. The 3rd month, the financial strain began to show cracks in the foundation. The rent from the main house was not in the portal on the 1st of the month. Instead, a message came through. It was from my father to management. This is Richard O'Reilly. My paycheck from the warehouse is delayed by a few days. Please inform the owner that I will be paying the rent on the 4th of the month. This should be fine, as we are family. Sarah at Maple Ridge didn't even need to ask me what to do. The system was automated. At 12:01 a.m. on the 2nd of the month, the portal automatically assessed the 10% late fee stipulated in the lease. My father's next login would show a new, higher balance. There was no informing the owner. There was no family. There was only the system. The rent, plus the full, non-negotiable late fee, was paid on the 4th. Then came Tom's attempt at manipulation. He was a man who believed his value lay in his handiness, his ability to barter and charm his way out of obligations. He called the Maple Ridge office directly, bypassing the portal. Sarah sent me the call summary. Listen, he told her, his voice apparently slick with false bonhomie. The gutter on the west side is hanging a little loose, and I noticed the back door handle is sticky. I'm great with this stuff. Tell Marin I'll just take care of all of it, get it all fixed up, and we can just call it even on, say, $300 of the rent. A little barter. Win-win. Sarah's response was, by her own account, cheerfully robotic. Thank you for submitting a maintenance request for the gutter and the door. Mr. Hansen, as per your lease agreement, Clause 12 billions, all tenants are expressly forbidden from performing any unauthorized repairs. Attempting to do so is a material breach of your lease. We will be dispatching our own insured handyman to assess the situation. Thank you. Tom, Sarah noted, had hung up without another word. His attempt to trade his unskilled labor for real money had hit a wall of legal liability. He was not a partner, he was a tenant, and a high-risk one at that. The true test of the new regime came with the first quarterly inspection. Sarah went, clipboard and digital camera in hand. I remained in my office, awaiting the report. When it landed in my inbox, it painted a stark, detailed picture of their new reality. The main house was tidy, depressingly so. The report noted that the thermostat was set to 60 degrees in the middle of a cold March. The pantry, which Sarah was required to check for signs of pests, contained mostly generic brand pasta, canned beans, and powdered milk. The joyous, wasteful abundance of their former lives had been stripped bare. The real problem, however, was in the granny suite. Under observations, Sarah had written, tenant has installed an unauthorized, non-permitted 5,000-watt gasoline-powered generator on the back patio directly against the exterior wall. A heavy-gauge extension cord is running in through a cracked window, which has been sealed with duct tape. This is a severe fire and carbon monoxide hazard and a material breach of the lease. Mr. Hansen, of course, furious at the new sub-meter that was accurately billing him for his wife's 24/7 space heater, had tried to create his own off-grid power. My response was immediate. Serve them the cure or quit notice. 48 hours. Violation, unauthorized equipment, and creation of unsafe hazard. If the generator is not completely removed along with all associated wiring and the window professionally repaired at their expense, file for eviction on Monday morning. I did not go. I did not yell. I did not confront. I simply activated the next phase of the system. The legal notice, delivered by a process server that afternoon, was a far more terrifying message than any angry phone call from me could ever have been. They were learning in the most visceral way that the rules were real. The game was over. The generator was gone by the next morning. In the silence that followed, I began to get reports of their new lives, pieced together from public records and the simple, unavoidable gossip of a town like Maple Hollow. The transformation was brutal and complete. Katie, for the first time in her adult life, had gotten a job. She was a receptionist at a dental office, a 30-hour-a-week position that she had once scoffed at. I did the math. Her entire net paycheck, her first real-world wages, would just barely cover her 1/4 share of the rent, leaving Tom to pay for their food, their car, their insurance, and the debt he'd brought into the marriage. The king-sized bed and vanity table were a distant, childish dream. The Hansens were hit the hardest. Mrs. Hansen, the woman who had timed my showers to the minute, was now selling her precious collection of antique porcelain on Facebook Marketplace to cover her and her husband's share of the newly sub-metered electricity bill. And Mr. Hansen, the man of leisure, the golf partner, had taken a job as a night security guard for an office park. His days of cigars and club lunches were over, replaced by 10-hour shifts walking empty hallways in a cheap uniform. And my parents, that was the deepest cut. My father, who had defined his retirement by his golf handicap, had sold his clubs. He was now working as a seasonal loader at a local furniture warehouse, lifting couches and dressers. My mother, who had once prattled on about shopping alliances and boutique finds, was working the 5 a.m. opening shift at the Maple Hollow Bakery, packing bread and cleaning trays, on her feet before the sun came up. The dinners in that house, I imagined, were silent, exhausted affairs. The old, easy chatter about golf scores and shopping trips was gone, replaced by the crushing, unspoken weight of the rent check due on the 1st. Every conversation about money was no longer abstract. It was about survival. They were finally, painfully learning the true cost of a roof. They were learning what it felt like, in their bones, in their aching feet and sore backs, to pay for the electricity, the water, and the taxes that Marin just handled for all those years. They were being forced to live in the real world I had inhabited all along, and they hated it. The house at 142 Maple Hollow Lane was quiet, but it was not peaceful. It was the strained, metallic silence of a pressure cooker sitting on a high flame. The pressure was building, the safety valve was rattling, and I knew with the certainty of a well-read contract that something was eventually, inevitably, going to blow. The night the fire started, a vicious late April wind was trying to tear Maple Hollow from its foundations. It howled around the corners of the house, rattling the old window frames and making the power flicker. I was miles away in my silent apartment, tracking the storm on a weather app. When my phone buzzed with an alert I had never received before, it wasn't a text or a call. It was a push notification from the Maple Ridge Property Management Master Portal, the one I used to oversee my entire portfolio. The icon was a flashing red triangle, urgent, smoke alarm triggered. Unit 142 Maple Hollow Lane, Suite B, dispatching on-call technician, ETA, 12 minutes. I stared at the screen, my heart giving a single, hard thump against my ribs. When I'd taken over, I'd had Sarah's team install a new top-of-the-line system in all my properties. It wasn't just a smoke detector. It was a network of IoT sensors that monitored for smoke, carbon monoxide, and unusual temperature spikes. When triggered, it didn't just make noise. It automatically alerted the 24/7 on-call service. This was the system in action. The house was in crisis, and the first responders were not my family, but my employees. I did not call the house. I simply opened my laptop and pulled up the live incident report log. The clock had started. According to the detailed, time-stamped report Sarah sent me the next morning, the scene was one of pure chaos. When her technician, a calm ex-firefighter named Dave, arrived, the high-pitched shriek of the smoke alarm was piercing the windy night. Dave, using his landlord-issued master key, let himself into the granny suite to find Tom flapping a dish towel uselessly at the detector on the ceiling while Mrs. Hanson screamed at him. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt plastic. A wall outlet behind a threadbare armchair was blackened and melted, with a faint trail of smoke still curling toward the ceiling. Tom, his face pale with panic, immediately started babbling about a power surge and the terrible old wiring in this place. Mrs. Hanson, however, had her own narrative ready. "It was the space heater," she shrieked at Dave, pointing a trembling finger at the small electric heater in the corner. "It must be defective. We'll sue the manufacturer. This is a landlord's responsibility. The appliances you provide." Dave, according to his report, simply ignored them. He killed the power to the suite at the breaker box, confirmed there were no active flames, and then began his methodical assessment. His report was clinical, precise, and utterly damning. EO Incident Cause Analysis, 142 Maple Hollow, Suite Burr. 1. Initial inspection revealed severe thermal damage to a 120V wall outlet and surrounding drywall. The circuit breaker for this section had tripped as designed. 2. The tenant-owned space heater was plugged into a different outlet on a separate circuit and was not a causal factor. The device shows no signs of malfunction. 3. Further investigation of the damaged outlet's wiring revealed an amateur, non-code compliant modification. The wiring had been improperly spliced and reconnected following the removal of a significant unauthorized external load. 4. The nature of the damage is consistent with a sustained overload caused by a faulty connection left behind after the tenant's illegal gasoline generator was disconnected in March. The connection was not properly terminated, creating a high-resistance point that eventually overheated and ignited the outlet's plastic housing. 5. Conclusion. The event was a direct result of tenant negligence and the creation of an unsafe electrical hazard in direct violation of lease agreement clauses 9C and 14A. The report was accompanied by a folder of high-resolution photographs, the melted outlet, the scorched wall, and, most damningly, a close-up of the dangerously frayed and amateurishly spliced wires inside the junction box. Mr. Hansen hadn't just removed his generator. He had left behind a fire waiting to happen. The system I had built moved with brutal efficiency. The report was automatically logged. An invoice for an emergency electrical repair from a licensed contractor was generated. A safety violation fine, as stipulated in the lease for creating a hazardous condition, was calculated. These two figures, a staggering total of just over $2,000, were automatically added to the Hansens' rental portal account, due with the next month's rent. An official notice of lease violation was emailed to them, citing the specific clauses and referencing the technician's report as evidence. There was no room for argument. Their lies and deflections were rendered meaningless by the stark, photographic proof. They couldn't blame the heater. They couldn't blame the old wiring. The fire had been started by their own incompetence and deceit. The next evening, Sarah scheduled a mandatory safety compliance meeting at the property. This time, all 6 tenants were required to be present. I, of course, was not there. Sarah ran the meeting, her clipboard her only weapon. She presented the findings, the photographic evidence, and the bill. According to her summary, the Hansens were silent, their faces gray with shame and fear. Tom looked at the floor. It was my father who spoke, his voice weak. We didn't know. We didn't know what he'd done with the wiring. That is irrelevant, Mr. O'Reilly, Sarah replied, her voice polite but firm. The lease holds the tenants of each unit responsible for their actions. However, due to the severity of this incident, the owner requires an additional assurance for the main house. She produced a new document, a simple 1-page addendum to their lease. It was titled Acknowledgement of Responsibility and Prohibition of Unauthorized Repairs. It stated in unambiguous legal language that the tenants acknowledged their responsibility to report all maintenance issues through the official portal and were expressly forbidden from attempting any repairs, electrical, plumbing, or structural, on their own. It stipulated that any violation of this clause would be considered a material breach, resulting in immediate eviction proceedings. The owner requires your signatures on this addendum, Sarah stated. There was a long, heavy silence. Then, with a hand that shook with age and defeat, my father took the pen. He signed his name. My mother signed after him, her signature a spidery, hesitant scrawl. Tom signed, and then Katie. She stared at the paper for a long moment, at the cold, black text. She looked around the kitchen at her exhausted parents, at her useless husband, at the bill for $2,000 sitting on the table. She took the pen, signed her name, and as she set it down, she let out a long, ragged breath. Being an adult, she whispered to no one in particular, is so expensive. It was the first honest thing I had heard her say in a decade. I read Sarah's detailed summary email the next morning in my office, a cup of coffee in my hand. I read about the panic, the lies, the irrefutable evidence, and the final, crushing surrender. I took a sip of my coffee, the warmth a small, pleasant sensation. I typed my reply to Sarah, a message consisting of only 2 words, proceed accordingly. I hit send and archived the email chain. As I sat there, a new thought began to surface. An idea that I imagined was simultaneously dawning on them in the cold, tense silence of the house on Maple Hollow Lane. They had been so focused on my perceived cruelty, on the coldness of the contracts and the systems, but in the quiet aftermath of a near disaster, a different truth was emerging. If I had been a stranger, an anonymous investor who had bought their defaulted mortgage from a bank, what would have happened last night? The fire would have been seen not as a mistake, but as a liability. A property with problem tenants who create fire hazards is a risk to be eliminated. A stranger wouldn't have just sent a bill. They would have sent an eviction notice to all 6 of them, using the fire as the perfect ironclad justification to get them out and re-rent the property to someone more reliable. My system, for all its cold, unforgiving logic, had also contained them. It had held them accountable, yes, but it had also, in its own way, kept them safe. The smoke alarm I had installed had saved the house. The technician I employed had prevented a real tragedy. The contract, which they hated, was now the only thing giving them the right to stay. The next morning, another notification popped up on my phone. Manual payment received via cashier's check. Tenant John Hanson. Amount, fine plus repair costs. He hadn't waited for the next rent cycle. He had gone to the bank, withdrawn the cash, and had it delivered to the Maple Ridge office first thing in the morning. A desperate, terrified act of full compliance. Sarah emailed me a picture of the envelope. "They didn't say a word," she wrote. "Just dropped it on the reception desk and left." I didn't reply, "Thank you." I didn't feel gratitude. I felt a quiet, grim sense of vindication. Kindness, I was learning, was not always about softness and forgiveness. Sometimes the greatest kindness you can offer people who refuse to be responsible is the hard, sharp, unyielding gift of discipline. The email arrived 6 months to the day after the fire. It was a period of perfect, uninterrupted compliance. The rent from both units arrived on the first of the month, every month. Maintenance requests were submitted formally through the portal for minor issues, a dripping faucet, a loose cabinet hinge, and were handled by my team without comment. The pressure cooker had not exploded. It had simply settled into a low, simmering boil. The silence from them was absolute, a void I had come to appreciate as the sound of a well-run business. The email was from my father, sent to the official Maple Ridge management address. It was short, stripped of his usual bluster and excuses. The subject line was simply, a request. Dear Ms. O'Reilly, I am writing to formally request a meeting. I know all communication is to go through the management company, but this is a personal matter. I am asking if you would be willing to come to the house one time so we can speak with you in person. Sincerely, Richard O'Reilly, tenant, 142 Maple Hollow Lane. He had followed the rules, addressing me by my formal name, identifying himself as a tenant. But the words "come to the house, not inspect the property," were a quiet, desperate appeal to a relationship beyond the lease. I considered it for a full day. I weighed the risks of reopening a wound against the potential for something. I did not know what. In the end, I decided to accept, but on my own terms. My reply, sent via Sarah, was a model of professional precision. Mr. O'Reilly, your request for an in-person meeting has been received. Ms. O'Reilly has agreed to a meeting at the property on Saturday at 2:00 p.m. The meeting will be 30 minutes in duration. Please be advised that a representative from Maple Ridge Property Management will also be present to document the proceedings. Please confirm your attendance and that of all other tenants. There would be a time limit, and there would be a witness. When Sarah and I arrived on Saturday, the change was immediately palpable. The front lawn was neatly mowed, the porch was swept clean. When my father opened the door, the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was not the old, familiar scent of my mother's potpourri, but the warm, yeasty, professional aroma of fresh bread and sugar. The living room was immaculate. There was no clutter, no piles of magazines or discarded shopping bags. The furniture was old and worn, but it was clean and arranged with a deliberate, almost Spartan neatness. The 6 of them were there, sitting not in a comfortable family sprawl, but in a formal waiting arrangement on the sofas and chairs. They all stood when I entered. It was unnervingly respectful. I did not sit. Sarah stood beside me, holding a tablet, her presence a silent reminder that this was official business. My father spoke first, his voice raspy, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall just over my shoulder. "Thank you for coming, Marin," he said, the use of my first name a small, daring step. "We won't take much of your time. I wanted to say something." He finally met my gaze. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, weary shame. "That day, last Christmas, I want to apologize, not for what happened, but for what I didn't do. My job was to protect my family, and that includes you, and I didn't. I chose to be silent instead of choosing you. That was my failure, and I am sorry for it." The apology was clean. It had no excuses attached, no buts or if-onlys. It was a simple, stark admission of a moral failing. Before I could process it, Katie stood up. She was thinner, and there were faint dark circles under her eyes. She was not wearing any makeup. She looked her age for the first time in her life. She was not crying. When I got my first paycheck from the dentist's office, she began, her voice quiet and flat, I looked at the number, the take-home pay after taxes, and I thought it was a mistake. I thought they'd miscalculated. She looked down at her hands. I worked 30 hours that week. My feet hurt so badly I had to soak them in ice water every night. The dentist was mean and a patient yelled at me, and at the end of all that, the money they gave me, it wasn't even enough to cover my share of the rent and the utilities, not even close. Her eyes finally filled with tears, but these were different from the crocodile tears of her past. They were the slow, heavy tears of a dawning, brutal understanding. I never knew, she whispered, her voice cracking. All those years I just thought money appeared. I am so sorry, Marin. I'm sorry that I saw you as an obstacle to what I wanted instead of the only person who was actually holding everything together. Then, to my complete astonishment, Mr. Hanson cleared his throat. He and his wife were standing together, their posture rigid. Marin, he said, the name sounding foreign and difficult in his mouth. My wife and I would also like to apologize. We behaved with an appalling sense of entitlement. We treated this house as if it were our right. We treated you with disrespect. There is no excuse for our behavior. We were wrong. Mrs. Hanson nodded beside him, her face pale. The room fell silent. They had all spoken. They had confessed their specific sins, and then they waited. I noticed what they hadn't done. No one had mentioned the rent. No one had asked for a reduction or a loan or a moment of pity. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a reckoning. They were not asking to be let off the hook financially. They were asking if it was possible, one day, to be let off the hook morally. They were asking to be allowed to bear their responsibility without being hated for it forever. I let the silence hang in the air for a long time. A full minute. I wanted them to understand that forgiveness was not a discount. It was not a prize to be won with a well-worded apology. It was a separate, more complex transaction, and I was not ready to approve it. Finally, I spoke. The wound doesn't disappear, I said, my voice measured and calm. What happened in this house? The choices you all made, they don't get erased. I saw my mother flinch, my father's shoulders slump, but I continued. From this point forward, we will speak to each other through on-time behavior. We will communicate through respect for the property and adherence to the contract. That is the only language I'm interested in. I was not offering them absolution. I was offering them a clear, transactional path toward a different kind of relationship, one built not on the shifting sands of emotion and obligation, but on the solid bedrock of mutual respect for rules. Beside me, I heard the soft tapping of Sarah's stylus on her tablet. I glanced over. She had made a note in the meeting log. Meeting with tenants was amicable. Tenants expressed remorse for past behavior. No requests were made to alter the terms of the existing lease agreements. My 30 minutes were up. The meeting is concluded, I said. Thank you for your time. I turned and walked to the door. As I stepped out onto the porch, I felt a single cold flake land on my cheek. I looked up. The sky was a uniform, pearly gray, and the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, 6 months early. As I walked to my car, a realization settled over me. For the past 6 months, they had been dealing with Maple Ridge Property Management. They had been tenants interacting with a system. But today, for the first time, they had not been speaking to the system. They had been speaking to me. They had met their landlord, yes, but in the quiet, desperate honesty of that room they had, for the first time in a very long time, also met their daughter and their sister. The snow fell a little harder, dusting my shoulders. A new countdown had begun, not one of my making, with a deadline and a penalty. This one was theirs alone, a slow, quiet, day-by-day countdown to see if it was possible to rebuild a home on the foundations of a rental property. The work had just begun. The invitation arrived via the Maple Ridge portal, as all communication now did. It was a formal request, logged and time-stamped, for my presence at the house on Christmas Day at noon. Not for a party, it specified, just for a conversation. 1 year, 365 days, since I had last stood in that living room and dismantled their world. I accepted. When I walked through the front door at precisely 12 o'clock, the scene was one of quiet, sober intention. There were no flashing lights, no blaring music. The scent of pine was subtle from a simple wreath on the door, and the air was filled with the same warm, professional smell of my mother's baking from the bakery. The dining room table was set with 7 placemats. My chair was not an island, it was simply a seat at the table, waiting for me. They were all there, standing as I entered. They looked older, worn down by a year of hard work and harder lessons, but their eyes were clear. There was no resentment in their gazes, only a profound, weary gravity. I took my seat, and my father slid a document across the table toward me. It was not a lease I had drafted, it was one they had prepared. "This is our proposal, Marin," he said quietly. I read the title, Voluntary 12-Month Lease Renewal Agreement. I scanned the clauses. They were offering to renew their tenancy for a full year. They had included clauses explicitly accepting the quarterly inspection schedule and taking financial responsibility for all non-structural repairs under a certain dollar amount. They were not asking for a discount, they were proactively volunteering to be the tenants I had forced them to become. They were choosing to accept the discipline. As I read, my mother gently pushed a small, polished wooden box across the table. It was my grandmother's old recipe box. I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded index cards, was the silver-framed photograph of her, and beneath it, a single folded piece of paper, brittle with age. I recognized my grandmother's elegant, looping script. I unfolded it. It read, "A home is a place that must hold both discipline and love. One without the other is a cage or chaos." My eyes stung, a sudden, sharp betrayal of the composure I had maintained for a year. I looked up at my mother, and she gave me a small, sad nod. She understood. Katie stood then, her hands clasped in front of her. She did not approach me. She stood her ground by her chair and looked me straight in the eye. "I've thought a lot about what I owe you," she said, her voice steady, stripped of all its former theatrics. "For the years you paid the bills, for the tax debt, for everything. And I've realized you don't owe me anything. Not forgiveness, not a relationship, nothing. It's the other way around. I owe you a lifetime of learning how to be an adult. Thank you for the lesson." It was the most profound apology she could have given, an acknowledgement not just of her actions, but of the fundamental flaw in her character that I had been forced to correct. My father then stepped forward, holding something in his outstretched hand. It was the key to the small office, the one I had locked a year ago. A peace offering, a symbol of returning control. I looked at the key, then at his face, and I shook my head. "No," I said, my voice quiet but absolute. "The management company holds all the keys. That is the procedure." I was not rejecting his gesture of peace. I was reinforcing the boundary that had saved us all. I was not falling back into the role of the daughter who fixes things. I was the owner, and the owner follows the procedure. I reached into my own briefcase and retrieved a small, rectangular object. It was a professionally engraved plaque, dark gray with sharp white lettering. I stood, walked to the back of the front door where the Christmas wreath was hanging, and affixed the plaque to the wood just below it. It read, "Rental property. For all inquiries, please contact management." It was a permanent, final declaration, a sign for them and for any visitor of the new and unchanging reality of this house. I returned to the table and took out one last document of my own. It was a single-page addendum to their renewal offer. "I accept your proposal," I said, with one final condition. I slid the paper to the center of the table. "This addendum must be signed." I read the single critical clause aloud, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "All personal communication, whether verbal, written, or electronic, regarding the property, its maintenance, or its financial obligations, is hereby superseded by the official communication channels of the designated property management company. Any attempt to bypass these official channels will be considered a material breach of the lease and will serve as immediate grounds for termination of the tenancy agreement." This was the final lock on the final door. It was the clause that protected me, and them, from ever falling back into the toxic roles of the past. It ensured that our relationship as landlord and tenant would always be buffered by the impersonal, unemotional shield of professional procedure. No one protested. No one argued. My father took the pen and signed. My mother followed. Then Tom and a quiet, composed Katie. Finally, the Hansons, 6 signatures, the ink settling into the paper like a belated, solemn oath. It was done. I stood up and walked to the small wooden box on the table. I gently touched the glass over my grandmother's smiling face. "I kept the house safe, Grandma," I whispered, so low only she and I could hear. I kept it safe with the law and with a straight spine. Then I turned and walked out of the house. I did not say goodbye. The cold December air hit my face, a clean, sharp shock. The heavy front door clicked shut behind me, the sound as final and percussive as an iron seal being stamped onto a deed. As I stood on the top step, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I pulled it out. It was a notification from the Maple Ridge portal, advanced security deposit received. Tenant Richard O'Reilly. Advanced security deposit received. Tenant John Hanson. At that exact, precise moment, the bells from the old church on Main Street began to ring, their deep, resonant chimes marking the noon hour of Christmas Day. The deposits were in. The bells were ringing. The year was over. I walked down the stone steps, my heels clicking on the pavement, and I did not look back. My story did not need a future. The victory was the ending. Thank you so much for listening to my story.